Hello everyone, today I will continue to bring the science fiction drama, the third and fourth episodes of The Last Man on Earth. Before we get into it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more interesting movie recaps. In the last video, we talked about Phil proposing to Carol. At the beginning of the third episode, Phil had a dream. He dreamed that he was reluctant to marry Carol, and he questioned why they needed to abide by traditional marriage customs when they were the only two left in the world. Carol said, "Of course it wasn't just us." Then the church door was pushed open, and people stood outside. Phil was stunned by Carol's laughter and the people's blessings outside the door. He woke up from this nightmare. He quickly got up and opened the window to confirm that there were no other human beings on Earth. He was relieved. After all, he had no choice but to marry Carol. As soon as Phil calmed down, Carol came to him with dinner. Carol suggested that between the two of them, they needed to elect a president of the United States. Phil felt that there was no point in having a president with two people. But, if she insisted, he thought Carol should be president. Carol said she did not have the talent to be president, and that the president of the US certainly needed to be elected by the people of the whole country. So the two of them voted for Phil simultaneously. In this way, Phil became the president of the United States, who ruled the last two humans in the world, and Carol naturally became the first lady. Carol brought spaghetti for dinner, and because of the discontinuation of meat production, she could only use raisins instead of meatballs, which felt like a symbol for their forced marriage. Then the two began to discuss marriage matters. Phil was responsible for finding the wedding ring, and Carol was responsible for everything else. She also sent Phil a walkie-talkie so that they could communicate while they worked. The next day, the two worked separately. Carol used the master key to pry open the door of the store to collect supplies. Phil hosted a bachelor farewell party with his little ball friends in broad daylight. On one side, Carol did her best to set up the venue alone, and on the other side, Phil spent the time leisurely and even made popcorn. Carol used the walkie-talkie to inquire about Phil's progress, but Phil said that he was swamped. However, when he looked back, he saw Carol, and the atmosphere was a little embarrassing for a while. Phil ran to the beauty dummy in the shop window and complained, saying that he could not help but marry Carol, just like a scumbag who is reluctant to part with his ex-girlfriend. Meanwhile, Carol had made the layout of the wedding scene so beautiful. Their witness was a tape recorder. In this sacred ceremony, Phil wore shorts and a t-shirt, waiting for the bride in full dress as she walked down the aisle. After the two parties finished their marriage vows, Phil confessed that he did not find a wedding ring, so Carol left angrily. A rift had appeared in the marriage before it was even official. Ashamed, Phil went to Carol's house to find her, but because he didn't hear a response, he broke in with the master key. After entering, he discovered that Carol had prepared the wedding cake and the wedding banquet scene. Such a careful arrangement made Phil even more ashamed. Once he found Carol, he complained about a lot of Carol's shortcomings, but in the end, he said that even so, he didn't want to live in a world without her. Phil's truth touched Carol, so the two reconciled. In the car, Phil gave Carol a hammer and then took her to the jewelry store to search for jewelry. Phil filled Carol's hands with precious rings, and the two returned to the church to get married. After returning home, Phil was eating the cake. Carol took off her wedding dress and let him come to the room. The two of them jointly carried out the great cause of human reproduction. Phil, who has always claimed that he is very good in bed, looked very nervous. At the same time, Carol, someone who was very against premarital relations, was very enthusiastic. So the first night of the two together was filled with Carol's strange cry and Phil's silence. Afterward, Carol was eating canned food while giving advice to Phil's performance. She hoped that Phil could be more aggressive and Phil hoped that both parties could finish quietly. After the night, their relationship made rapid progress. Carol was well integrated into Phil's life. They played squash together during the day and had fun in the evening. When he got up the next day, Phil wore protective clothing and asked Carol to spray him with a musket and drove a bulldozer over a pile of beer. Phil also took Carol to see his girlfriend in front of the window, but Carol tore his ex-girlfriend into pieces with jealousy. On the way home, Phil said to Carol that he didn't expect his married life to be as good as it was. Maybe they were a destined pair. As soon as Phil finished speaking, an accident happened immediately. A limo crossed an intersection where there should be no one, and they accidentally ran into it. A car crossing the intersection meant someone was inside. Phil quickly got out of the car to check the situation of the accident. He never expected that, out of the limousine, would walk a beautiful blonde woman. Phil's heart instantly skipped a beat. At this time, Carol was still stuck in the airbag in the car, and the blonde woman hurried to see Carol's condition. Carol was shocked to see the third living person in the world and didn't even care about her knee injury. At the same time, Phil rushed over and grabbed the driver's seat of the limousine. Since seeing this beauty, Phil seemed to be a different person. He stared as the woman chatted with Carol sitting in the back awkwardly. The name of the blonde beauty turned out to be Lisa. 2 weeks ago, she saw Phil's sign saying, "Alive in Tucson," before she came here. She arrived earlier than Carol, but she kept going around and couldn't find anyone. Phil was immensely regretful that he didn't write the specific address on the billboard. Carol said that if Lisa could have shown up earlier, she might have been able to attend her wedding. After Phil saw this beauty, he regretted the hasty marriage with Carol. The three drove to Phil's house. Carol deliberately or unconsciously talked ill of Phil, revealing that he had stolen valuable collections and ruined her house. Then Phil invited Lisa to stay at his house so that he could take care of her, but Lisa decided to find a place by herself. Lisa parted and hugged Carol. Phil took the opportunity to hold Lisa behind to take advantage of her and smelled her hair abnormally. He held on until Lisa couldn't bear it. At dinner time, to win Lisa's favor, Phil tidied up his hair and beard and changed back to the handsome man he was before the world ended. During dinner, Phil took the initiative to ask Lisa to tell them more about herself. No matter what she said, Phil agreed with her. Carol tried to get into the conversation as much as possible. When they talked about Lisa's ex-husband's cheating, Phil immediately said that he hated this kind of person the most, but he didn't know that he was doing such a thing. Lisa liked Carol very much, but couldn't bear the strange behavior of Phil, so she left with the excuse of going to bed. In the evening, Carol invited Phil to carry out the human reproduction plan, but after Phil saw Lisa, he was no longer interested in Carol. He rejected Carol by saying that he was sick. Before leaving, Carol asked Phil if he liked Lisa. Phil said without thinking that he was not interested in her. That night, Phil dreamed that Lisa was wearing pajamas to seduce him. Phil happily went, but when he turned the corner, he saw Carol sitting on the toilet, and Phil woke up again. The next day Lisa came to Phil for something. Phil was in the living room outside his house, pretending to exercise, trying to radiate his masculine charm, which was almost next to nothing. Lisa also found that there was an extra car at her door, which turned out to be Phil's consolation gift to make up for the car that she had crashed the day before. Carol was not happy. She said, "You have time to get a car for another woman but don't have time to fix the door for me?" Phil hinted to Carol, saying that this door was like their marriage, and there was no need to repair it if it wasn't broken in the first place. Carol pretended not to understand and asked Phil to fix the door quickly, so Phil had to go to the hardware store to find tools. Carol took Lisa home and they sat together to look through her wedding photos. The only two women in the world sitting together naturally have a lot to say. Carol said that she married Phil for the sake of human reproduction, and she thanked him for his willingness to cooperate. Lisa talked about going to cafes everywhere in the past year, pretending that the world was still functioning normally. The conversation between the two was delightful. The next day, Phil worked hard to repair the door. Later, Lisa invited Phil and Carol to her house for a beer. In the next scene, only Phil and Lisa were watching the sunset and drinking beer. It turned out that Phil didn't notify Carol at all and lied to Lisa that Carol was sick and couldn't come. He was enjoying the time alone with Lisa. After drinking the beer, Lisa began to confide in Phil. She confessed that she didn't have a good impression of Phil at first, but through Carol's explanation, she realized that Phil was not evil. Perhaps because of alcohol, Lisa said that she was very attracted to him. The long-term loneliness made her long for the pleasure of going to bed with someone. Phil immediately began to undress. Halfway through, Lisa turned her conversation around and said, it was a pity that he was the only married man left in the world, and she had no chance. Phil thought this was a hint from Lisa, and he immediately left to go find Carol, wanting to talk about their marriage. As soon as he arrived at his and Carol's house, he saw she had specially made a portrait of the two of them to thank Phil for repairing the door for her. This made it difficult for Phil to speak. He had to excuse again that he was sick and left. In fact, the door symbolizes the marriage of the two. The marriage was ruined by Phil at the beginning. Still, Carol hoped that this imperfect marriage would be like the door, which could be repaired and decorated and become very beautiful. Regardless of the marriage, from the point of view of reproduction, Phil thought having a relationship with two women simultaneously was more efficient than monogamy. And in the particular circumstances of the end times, is there any point in emotional relationships after all? Should the traditional moral concepts and secular conventions of mankind still be abided by? If you were Phil in the play, what choice would you make when faced with such a situation? You are very welcome to share your thoughts in the comment area. Subscribe to our channel for the next episode of The Last Man. And we will see you in the next video.
Bye!